So, welcome to a different style of video than what you're probably used to, especially on my channel. This video is going to be a little more analytical as we're diving into two games that are very old and very popular. Donkey Kong and its successor, Donkey Kong Jr. I'll be trying to pick apart these two games to ultimately decide which is better. I've wanted to do this sort of video for a while now. I think I mentioned it in a Mega Man video. If you can find the clip, please play it. I don't know, I was thinking about doing this thing where I just kind of like take two similar-ish games and like put them together and see which one I like, in a sort of review style thing where I put the two games together. Oh, there I go. The whole point of it would be to say which one's better, which one at the end, my decision of which one's better. But I'm finally getting around to do it now. Of course, this is all my opinion, so you're entitled to not agree with me and even spark up some conversation in the comments. That's actually why I chose these two games to start off the series. If I end up doing more, that is. Because these two games are very similar and probably don't have a lot of dedicated fans, so I can say as much as I want without the fear of offending people. Anyway, without further ado, let's begin. First, let's back up a bit and give a little context for the games we'll be comparing today. Both games were made in the 1980s, and Miyamoto, who is now the famed creator and quote-unquote father of Mario, came into the picture with an idea to create an arcade game to try and capture the same success Pac-Man had. I believe it was actually Miyamoto's first game to have worked on, and strangely, it seems like it was originally going to be a game about Popeye, the spinach guy. But they never got the clear to from their creators, so Mario was born in its stead. For the other characters' inspiration, Miyamoto got King Kong, unsurprisingly, and Beauty and the Beast for the lady with the monkey. When the arcade hit the cabinets, it was a success, and ultimately cemented a hairy ape and a heroic plumber in our minds for the next 40 years, and likely onward. Donkey Kong Jr., the sequel, came out of a desire to use ideas they had for the first game that didn't quite fit with the original Donkey Kong. So, they made Donkey Kong Jr. to try out their new ideas. In fact, they originally wanted Donkey Kong himself to be the main character of the new game, but due to his massive size, they settled for a new character, Donkey Kong's son, DK Jr. The goal of this new game was very similar to the first, get to the top left area of the screen as fast as possible, but it was the journey and setting that made it so unique. This game, too, became wildly popular and eventually spawned a third game, but we're not here to talk about that. Anyway, both games got ported to the NES about half a decade later, which led to the moment of me playing this on the NES Mini and being able to talk to you about it. Now, it's time to start putting these two games up against each other. I'll be judging which game is better based on a couple of separate categories, including graphics, gameplay, mechanics, creativity, complexity, and subtle design choices. I'm choosing each category based off of things that are more objective rather than subjective, because I want to keep as much bias out of this as possible, which is why fun is not a category, although that'll undoubtedly play a factor because I'm a little biased. So, based off that list that I just read, we should probably look at graphics first. But, as these were both arcade games and sequels to each other on top of that, their graphics are extremely similar. Similar to a point where it'd probably get a little subjective based on smaller details and such. And as I just said, I'm trying to keep this as unbiased as possible. So, to solve this, I'm going to give both sides a point. It's a little unsatisfying, I know, but I'm not very professional, so just deal with it, I guess. That leaves us of a score with 1-1, so let's hope this next category will help someone put it forth in the lead. And speaking of which, next we're doing mechanics. This is something we can definitely prove one game is superior with than the other. Mechanics are basically what you can physically do in the game, which does differ from gameplay, as mechanics is a more dry and bare-bones version of gameplay, removing how well the mechanics are actually implemented. Excluding basic movement options like moving left or right and jumping, the unique mechanics of each game is thus. In Donkey Kong, Mario is able to climb up blue ladders, and sometimes yellow, which allow him to get to higher places, unsurprisingly, or lower places too. Mario is also able to pick up these hammers, which then allow him to break barrels and make his life a lot easier. There's also these vertically moving platforms, which can lift you up, maybe not as quick as you could climbing, but still pretty dang quick, and it's still pretty cool. In Donkey Kong Jr., however, instead of climbing ladders, you climb the more thematically relevant vines, or rope, I guess, in some cases. But that's not all. Donkey Kong Jr. can also ride these horizontally moving platforms rather than the vertically moving platforms, and for the most unique part of the game's mechanics is the ability to drop fruit on certain enemies to kill them. This is a little difficult to time, but it is basically the replacement of the hammer in this game, and while not as useful, is still kind of fun and unique way to deal with a special enemy defeating power-up. And of course, in each game, you've got your separate ways to deal with the big bad at the end to defeat them. In Donkey Kong, you've got to walk across these little, I'm assuming, like screws, in order to break open the girders and make Donkey Kong fall. In Donkey Kong Jr., however, you have to push up these keys all across these vines to unlock the cage that Donkey Kong is in to free him. Now, to actually compare the two games and their mechanics, we can start with the horizontal and vertically moving platforms, which honestly don't really matter because, in my opinion, they're basically the same thing. One's horizontal, one's vertical. Maybe the vertical's a little bit better, but for the cases of this argument, we're going to say that they're basically the same. Now, with the enemy defeating items, such as the hammer and the fruit respectively, I think I'm going to have to go with Donkey Kong Jr. having the better version of that, just because we're on mechanics only, not gameplay. And honestly, the fruit is in a lot more positions to be useful than the hammer, because with the hammer you can't climb any ladders and you're stuck where you are on the same level for whatever you do, and plus, you can't even use the hammer in the second level, whereas you can use the fruit in all 4 of the separate Donkey Kong Jr. maps. So I'm going to have to give that one to Donkey Kong Jr. And moving on to the boss defeating mechanic, I'm also going to have to give Donkey Kong Jr. the win there because, well, honestly, I think it's more in tune to what the game is because you're climbing up vines the entire game, so of course your final challenge should be climbing up vines. And while Jumpman Mario does do a little bit of jumping over in the other one to destroy the girders, it's not really as thematically relevant to him as it is to Donkey Kong Jr. So, with that in mind, we're going to give this second mechanics point to Donkey Kong Jr. Next up, we've got gameplay, which, as I alluded to earlier, is very similar to mechanics, as it's more like the more fleshed out version of mechanics, since gameplay is more about how well the mechanics are actually implemented. So, if we look back at the mechanics that we mentioned in the previous section, we can see that the horizontally moving platforms and the vertically moving platforms are there, the means of defeating enemies such as the hammer and the fruit, and the way you defeat each boss in each game, the girder destruction and the key collection, respectively. And again, with the horizontally and vertically moving platforms, I don't think it really matters that much. I think maybe the vertically moving platforms are a little more impressive, maybe, but honestly it's so close that I don't think it really matters anyway. The enemy defeating items, however, in each game do actually pose a good thought to the superiority of each game. Because in Donkey Kong Jr., it's a very creative idea to use fruit to knock down enemies. In practice, it's not actually that fun or useful, to be honest. I mean, sometimes it is kind of fun whenever you do finally manage to nail it and hit somebody on the head. It doesn't happen often enough to be truly fun. In practice, it's actually a little clunky to use and not necessarily good. The hammer, however, is actually fun and practical to use. Aside from the fact that you can't climb up ladders, its use is pretty undeniable. It basically grants you immunity from everything while you have it, and you can kill fires and barrels. So, for this one, I'm going to have to give Donkey Kong the win there. But whenever you look at the boss defeating mechanics for each game and how well they're actually implemented, I'm going to have to give Donkey Kong the win as well. While I do mention how thematic the vine climbing is in Donkey Kong Jr., whenever you actually implement gameplay into the equation, it's not actually that interesting of an idea. You just climb up vines and you slide down, you climb up vines and you slide down. It's repetitive and kind of boring. But with the girder destroying things, it's actually it's really interesting because you are actively destroying something, and there's a little bit of fun with that destructive side to us all. It also introduces the yellow ladders and the yellow girders. It feels almost like a open world experience. I say that very loosely, but in the terms of you can go about the end fight in any way you want to. You could go up to the very top and work your way down, or you could go from the bottom up, or you could just go from in columns. You could do it however you want. And while there is a little bit of that into Donkey Kong Jr., it's not as much as it is in Donkey Kong. So overall, I think I'm going to give the win for gameplay to Donkey Kong. Next up, we're going to be doing creativity, which is basically the amount of unique things in each game. Like, for example, the fire in Donkey Kong. The fire is a unique enemy, aside from the barrels, that keeps Mario moving forward. Same goes with the spring from the same game, where it also acts as an obstacle to Mario. In Donkey Kong, there's also these items that you get hidden throughout the game that help boost your score, and that's pretty unique. On top of that, there are the things that we've already talked about in the last two segments, including the girder system at the end, the hammer, the fruit falling, all that good stuff. Now, there's actually plot in these games, although admittedly not a lot. In Donkey Kong, you're saving a princess named Pauline, not even a princess, just a gal named Pauline that Donkey Kong has stolen. And Mario uses his carpentry skills, not plumbing, to go ahead and save her. In Donkey Kong Jr., there's a slightly more creative story where DK's son, Donkey Kong Jr., has to save him from the evil Mario, where Mario is now bad now, which is a very unique take on something that hasn't been really done a lot, even now, where the hero becomes a villain in a sequel. So honestly, plot-wise, the second one is a little more creative with this. So we're looking pretty close for the two games, but I think the thing that really seals the deal for one particular game to move out ahead in the creativity category is the variety of enemies and just variety of things in Donkey Kong Jr. I mean, you've got the multiple different types of enemies, not just the one or two in Donkey Kong, and you've got the multiple different types of fruit that you can throw down instead of just the one type of hammer, and you've even got 4 separate levels instead of just 3 in the original. So there's just a bunch more in the second game than there is in the first, which leads me to put Donkey Kong Jr. as the winner for creativity. So next up, we're doing complexity, and by the very definition of complexity, it is the state or quality of being complex. And so the definition of complex is defined as consisting of many differed and connected parts. Incidentally, we kind of already figured out the complexity because we've been talking about the different parts of the game throughout this entire video. But now let's bring them all together as the second half of the definition indicates. Here, it's almost no contest, as I've mentioned even in the last one, creativity, where I basically said it was just how much stuff is in the game, that Donkey Kong Jr. has the more different parts all connected into one game. I guess that should mean that Donkey Kong Jr. gets the point for complexity, right? Right. I mean, we've talked about all throughout this video all the different complexities of each game, and as it turns out, Donkey Kong Jr. is the one that comes out on top throughout all of these, because there's just so much differing stuff in the game, all put into one single game. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of stuff in Donkey Kong, but compared to Donkey Kong Jr., there's just not as much. It's why I have to actually give the point to complexity to Donkey Kong Jr. once again. This actually leaves us in a pretty weird spot, because even if Donkey Kong gets the next point for subtle design choices, it still can't win, which means Donkey Kong Jr. has won overall as the better game. But because I still want to, I want to go over the subtle design choices real quick, because I think it's still worth mentioning. For subtle design choices, I was actually going to have Donkey Kong win, because there's a bunch more smaller details in that game than there is in Donkey Kong Jr. So briefly, I'll go over the subtle design choices in Donkey Kong Jr. The most unique of which is the spring skip you can do in the second stage, where if you jump on the spring at just the right time, you can jump onto the horizontally moving platform and skip a large portion of the level. Another one is the landing frame. It's 1 frame as soon as Donkey Kong Jr. lands on the ground. He has this weird, like, whoa movement. And it's an interesting thing that you never really see in actual gameplay because it happens in a fraction of a second. There's also fall damage in this game, so if you fall too far down, you die. And also there's a little small detail of Mario whipping out the little traps and birds. Donkey Kong, however, has a lot more. There includes the similar stuff from Donkey Kong Jr., like the fall damage, the landing frame, where there's a brief moment where Mario has like a "wah" movement. And Donkey Kong also does something up at the top that sort of signifies random stuff. But there's also the fact that Mario can actually get crushed by the vertically moving platforms. Plus, there's also the fire in the game, which spawns in a very creative way from a barrel that Donkey Kong deliberately throws at an oil barrel that spawns the fire. So it's a nice little in-universe way to show where the fire comes from. Finally, in the last stage, you can actually touch Donkey Kong and die from it, which is a fun little detail I found out, and it's... I don't know why they added that, but I love it. Basically, this is all to say that this is what the final tally would have looked like if I had planned this better. But there you have it. That is, which is better, Donkey Kong versus Donkey Kong Jr. And as you can see, Donkey Kong is better in my opinion. Of course, you're entitled to your own opinion, but I don't think you really have an opinion on this, to be quite frank. I mean, honestly, Donkey Kong Jr. is just a cooler game. I mean, what can I say? But yeah, that was everything I really wanted to cover, so... Thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. We took a way deeper dive into this game than we probably should have. Learned a lot of pointless facts about this game that you never need to know. And we addressed some questions that didn't need to be addressed. But regardless, I hope you enjoyed this. Bye!